Captain James Sullivan had served as a royal guard for 15 years, but he had never been assigned to courthouse duty until the Pemberton custody case began. The case involved Lady Margaret Pemberton, a distant relative of the royal family, her bitter divorce from Lord Charles Pemberton. What made this case special was the presence of their 7-year-old daughter, Emma, whose testimony would determine which parent would receive custody. The courtroom was filled with tension, as expensive lawyers argued over millions of pounds and the future of a little girl who sat quietly between her parents. Emma Pemberton was small for her age, with curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes that seemed too serious for a child. She wore a navy blue dress with white collar, and her hands were folded carefully in her lap as she watched the proceedings with an understanding that seemed beyond her years. Judge Harold Blackwood presided over the case with an air of authority that made everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable. He was known for his harsh decisions and his intolerance for anything that disrupted his court. Judge Blackwood had been handling family court cases for over 20 years, and his reputation was built on swift, decisive judgments that rarely favored the emotional needs of children over the financial interests of powerful families. Captain Sullivan stood at attention near the courtroom entrance, his red uniform immaculate and his bearing proud. His role was primarily ceremonial, presenting the Crown's interest and ensuring that justice was served fairly, especially in cases involving members of the royal family's extended circle. However, as he watched the proceedings unfold, Sullivan began to notice details that troubled him deeply. Emma's mother, Lady Margaret, appeared nervous and defeated. Her lawyer, though expensive, seemed unprepared and kept glancing nervously at Judge Blackwood as if seeking approval for his arguments. Lady Margaret's case was based on her desire to provide Emma with a stable, loving home environment where the child could attend local schools and maintain friendships with other children her age. Lord Charles Pemberton, on the other hand, was confident and domineering. His legal team was led by Richard Hawthorne, one of London's most ruthless family lawyers, who had a reputation for winning cases through intimidation and political connections rather than justice. Lord Charles wanted custody so he could send Emma to expensive boarding schools and shape her into what he called a proper lady worthy of the Pemberton name. During the first day of testimony, Captain Sullivan noticed that Emma kept glancing in his direction with an expression that seemed to be asking for help. The child's eyes held a fear that went beyond normal anxiety about her parents' divorce. There was something desperate in her gaze that made Sullivan's protective instincts activate. Even though he was supposed to remain neutral and silent during the proceedings, as Lady Margaret testified about her love for Emma and her desire to give the child a normal childhood, Judge Blackwood interrupted her frequently with harsh questions that seemed designed to make her appear unstable and unfit for custody. The judge's treatment of Emma's mother was so aggressive that several people in the courtroom began whispering among themselves about his unusual behavior. Lady Margaret, Judge Blackwood said with obvious disdain, "You claim to want what's best for Emma. But isn't it true that you've been seeing a psychiatrist for depression? How can a mentally unstable woman provide proper guidance for a child?" Lady Margaret's lawyer started to object, but Judge Blackwood waved him silent. "I'll allow the question. The court needs to understand the mother's mental fitness." Sullivan watched as Lady Margaret struggled to answer the judge's inappropriate question. Her depression had been mild and temporary, related to the stress of her divorce, and she had only attended a few counseling sessions. But Judge Blackwood was presenting it as if she were dangerously unstable. Emma's reaction to her mother's humiliation was heartbreaking. The little girl's hands clenched into small fists, and tears began forming in her eyes as she watched the judge attack her mother's character. She turned again to look at Captain Sullivan, and this time her expression was unmistakably a plea for help. During the lunch recess, Sullivan remained in the courtroom while most people left to eat. Emma had been instructed to stay with a court officer, but the officer had stepped out for a moment, leaving the child alone near the front of the courtroom. This gave Sullivan his first opportunity to observe Emma more closely. The little girl approached him hesitantly, looking around to make sure no adults were watching. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered. "Are you here to make sure everything is fair?" Sullivan was touched by the child's question and her obvious hope that someone in authority might help her. "I'm here to represent the Crown's interest in justice, young lady. Is there something troubling you about the proceedings?" Emma looked around nervously again, then stepped closer to Sullivan. "The judge is being mean to my mummy, and I think he's already decided to give me to Daddy. But Daddy, ... double quotes." She paused as if afraid to continue. "What about your father, Emma?" Sullivan asked gently, kneeling down to be at her eye level. "Daddy hurts people when he gets angry. He hurt Mummy lots of times, but she made me promise never to tell anyone. And he told me that if I ever said anything bad about him in court, he would make sure I never saw Mummy again." Emma's voice was barely audible, and her small body was shaking with fear. Sullivan felt his heart break as he realized that this innocent child was trapped between an abusive father and a corrupt judge who had apparently already decided the case. Emma's revelation about her father's violence explained why. Lady Margaret seemed so defeated and why the judge was working so hard to discredit her. Emma, Sullivan said carefully, "Has anyone else hurt you or made you afraid?" The little girl nodded slowly. "Judge Blackwood came to Daddy's house last week for dinner. I heard them talking about money and about how Daddy would make sure the judge got something, especially if he gave me to Daddy instead of Mummy. They didn't know I was listening. But I heard Daddy say that Mummy would never be able to prove anything." Sullivan realized that he was witnessing not just a custody battle, but a conspiracy involving judicial corruption and possibly child abuse. Emma's desperate glances at him during the morning session suddenly made perfect sense. The child had recognized his uniform as representing justice and authority, and she was hoping he could somehow help her escape the trap that powerful adults had set around her. The afternoon session was about to begin, and Sullivan knew that he faced an impossible choice. His duty as a royal guard required him to remain neutral and silent, but his conscience demanded that he protect an innocent child from corruption and abuse. The afternoon session began with Lord Charles Pemberton taking the witness stand. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 40s with silver hair and cold gray eyes that never seemed to show genuine emotion. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, and he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Captain Sullivan positioned himself where he could observe both the proceedings and Emma's reactions. The little girl sat rigidly in her chair, her small hands gripping the armrests as her father began his testimony. Sullivan noticed that Emma's breathing became shallow and rapid whenever Lord Charles looked in her direction, which was often during his testimony. Richard Hawthorne, Lord Charles's lawyer, led his client through a carefully rehearsed presentation of why he deserved custody of Emma. Lord Charles spoke about his wealth, his social connections, and his ability to provide Emma with the finest education money could buy. He painted himself as a devoted father who wanted only the best for his daughter. "Lord Pemberton," Hawthorne said smoothly, "please tell the court about your plans for Emma's education and upbringing." Lord Charles smiled coldly. "Emma will attend the finest boarding school, starting with Worthington Academy for young ladies. She'll spend her holidays traveling throughout Europe, learning languages and proper social graces. I intend to mold her into a lady worthy of the Pemberton name and legacy." Sullivan noticed that Emma flinched when her father mentioned boarding school. The child had already told him that she wanted to stay with her mother and attend regular schools with other children. Lord Charles's plan would essentially isolate Emma from anyone who might protect her from his abuse. Judge Blackwood nodded approvingly throughout Lord Charles's testimony, asking only friendly questions that allowed the man to elaborate on his wealth and social status. The contrast between his treatment of Lord Charles and his earlier aggressive questioning of Lady Margaret was obvious too, to everyone in the courtroom. When it came time for Lady Margaret's lawyer to cross-examine Lord Charles, Judge Blackwood placed severe restrictions on the questioning. "I want to remind counsel that we're here to determine what's best for the child, not to rehash marital disputes," the judge said sternly. "I won't allow fishing expeditions or attempts to smear Lord Pemberton's character." Lady Margaret's lawyer, clearly intimidated, asked only a few weak questions. About Lord Charles's travel schedule and his plans for spending time with Emma, he avoided any. Questions about domestic violence or Lord Charles's treatment of his wife during their marriage. Sullivan could see the frustration and despair in Lady Margaret's eyes as her lawyer failed to challenge her ex-husband's carefully constructed facade. During a brief recess, Sullivan noticed Emma trying to get her mother's attention. When Lady Margaret leaned down to listen to her daughter, Emma whispered something that made her mother's face go pale with fear. Lady Margaret quickly looked around the courtroom, her eyes meeting Sullivan's for just a moment before she looked away. After the recess, it was time for Emma's testimony. Judge Blackwood had decided to interview the child in his chambers rather than in open court, claiming it would be less intimidating for her. However, Sullivan suspected the real reason was to keep Emma's testimony away from public scrutiny. "Captain Sullivan," Judge Blackwood announced, "your presence will not be required during the child's interview. Please wait in the corridor." This was highly unusual. Royal guards were typically allowed to observe all proceedings in cases involving the royal family's interests. Sullivan realized that Judge Blackwood was deliberately excluding him because he feared the captain might witness something that could compromise the corruption scheme. "Your Honor," Sullivan said carefully, "my instructions from the Crown specify that I should observe all aspects of this case. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding?" Judge Blackwood's face darkened with anger. "Captain, are you questioning my authority in my own courtroom? I've decided that the child's interview will be conducted privately, and that decision is final." Emma looked frantically between Sullivan and the judge, her fear obvious to everyone present. She had been counting on the royal guard's presence for protection, and now she was being forced to face the corrupt judge alone with her abusive father present, as the adults argued about Sullivan's presence. Emma made a desperate decision. She had learned a simple hand signal system from a book about deaf communication that her governess had taught her months earlier. While the adults were distracted by their argument, Emma caught Sullivan's attention and quickly formed the letter H with her right hand, followed by E and L and P with her left hand. Sullivan recognized the sign language letters immediately. His younger brother was deaf, and Sullivan had learned basic sign language as a child to communicate with him. Emma was silently spelling out help with her small hands, confirming that she was terrified of what might happen to her. In the judge's private chambers, the little girl then did something even more clever. She pointed discreetly to her dress pocket and mouthed the word "recording" while making a tiny gesture with her fingers that indicated something small and hidden. Sullivan realized that Emma had somehow managed to bring a recording device with her, possibly hoping to capture evidence of the adult's corruption. Judge Blackwood finally noticed Emma's gestures and became suspicious. "What is the child doing with her hands?" "Emma, stop fidgeting and sit properly." Emma quickly folded her hands in her lap, but she had accomplished her goal. Sullivan now knew that she needed help, that she had some form of evidence, that she was terrified of being alone with the judge and her father. The captain's protective instincts were fully activated, and he began planning how he could intervene without exceeding his authority. "Your Honor," Sullivan said firmly, "I must insist on observing the child's testimony. The Crown has a specific interest in ensuring that justice is served in this matter, and my instructions are clear." Judge Blackwood realized that removing the royalist guard entirely might create suspicions that could reach higher authorities. He made a compromise that he thought would limit Sullivan's ability to interfere. "Very well, Captain. You may observe, but you will remain silent regardless of what you hear. Any interruption from you will result in your immediate removal and a formal complaint to your superiors." Sullivan nodded his agreement. "Oh, but he was already planning to break that promise if necessary." Emma's silent plea for help had activated his sworn duty to protect the innocent, and he was prepared to face the consequences of defying a corrupt judge if it meant saving a child from abuse. As they prepared to move to the judge's chambers, Emma looked back at Sullivan one more time. Her small hand formed a quick T, an H, an A, an N, and K in sign language, telling him that she understood he was trying to help her. The little girl's courage in the face of such fear impressed Sullivan and strengthened his resolve to find a way to protect her. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock everyone present and potentially expose the corruption that threatened to destroy an innocent child's life. Judge Blackwood's private chambers were smaller and more intimidating than the main courtroom. Heavy wooden furniture and dark law books created an atmosphere that would frighten any child, let alone one who was already terrified. Emma sat in a large leather chair that made her appear even smaller and more vulnerable, while her father stood behind her with his hands resting possessively on the chair's back. Captain Sullivan positioned himself near the door, as instructed, but he had a clear view of Emma and could observe everyone's behavior. The little girl kept her hands carefully folded in her lap, but Sullivan noticed that she occasionally touched her dress pocket where she had indicated the recording device was hidden. Judge Blackwood began the interview with questions that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate Emma rather than genuinely understand her preferences. His tone was harsh and impatient, nothing like the gentle approach that should be used when questioning a child witness. Emma, Judge Blackwood said sternly, I need you to understand that this is a very serious matter. Your answers will determine where you live and how your life will be arranged. Do you understand the importance of telling the truth? Emma nodded nervously, but Sullivan could see that the judge's aggressive tone was already making her more frightened. Lord Charles's hands tightened on the back of her chair, and Sullivan noticed Emma's shoulders tense in response to her father's touch. Now then, Judge Blackwood continued, I want you to tell me which parent you would prefer to live with. Your father has explained his excellent plans for your education and future. Surely an intelligent girl like you can see the advantages of living with him? The question was clearly leading and inappropriate. A proper custody interview should explore the child's feelings neutrally, not pressure her toward a predetermined answer. Sullivan watched as Emma struggled to find the courage to speak honestly, despite the obvious pressure from both her father and the judge. I want to stay with Mummy, Emma said quietly, her voice barely audible in the silent room. Lord Charles's grip on her chair tightened visibly, and Emma flinched as if expecting to be struck. Judge Blackwood's face showed irritation at her answer, and he leaned forward intimidatingly. Emma, I don't think you've really thought about this carefully. Your father can provide you with opportunities that your mother simply cannot match. He can send you to the finest schools and introduce you to important people. Why would you choose to limit your future prospects? Emma's hands began to tremble, but she found the courage to continue. Mummy reads to me every night and helps me with my homework. She takes me to the park and lets me play with other children. Daddy, ... double quotes. She paused, looking fearfully at her father. Daddy is always angry and yells at people. Lord Charles's face darkened with rage at his daughter's honesty. Emma, that's quite enough. Judge Blackwood, perhaps the child is confused by all the stress of these proceedings. Maybe it would be better if we concluded this interview and moved forward with the custody arrangement we discussed. Sullivan was shocked by Lord Charles's blatant reference to a predetermined arrangement. It was clear evidence that the custody decision had been made before Emma's testimony was even heard. The judge's response confirmed Sullivan's worst fears about the corruption involved in this case. Yes, perhaps you're right, Judge Blackwood agreed quickly. Emma, I think we have enough information to make a decision. You may return to the main courtroom now, but Emma wasn't finished. The little girl had been building up courage throughout the interview, and she suddenly found her voice. No, wait. I have something important to tell you. Emma reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small digital recording device that she had taken from her mother's purse. Her small fingers fumbled with the buttons, but she managed to start playing a recording that filled the chamber with clear audio. The recording was from the dinner conversation Emma had overheard between her father and Judge Blackwood the previous week. Lord Charles's voice came through clearly. So we're agreed, Harold. You give me custody of Emma, and the £50,000 will be transferred to your offshore account within 24 hours. Plus, I'll make sure you get that appointment to the High Court that you've been wanting, Judge Blackwood's recorded voice responded. The money is appreciated. Charles, but what I really want is assurance that this arrangement will remain completely confidential. If anyone discovers our agreement, both our careers will be destroyed. The blood drained from both men's faces as they realized that Emma had recorded their entire conspiracy. Lord Charles lunged toward his daughter, clearly intending to grab the recording device, but Emma was quicker. She tossed the device toward Captain Sullivan, who caught it smoothly. "Give me that recording immediately," Judge Blackwood shouted, his composure completely shattered. "That child has no right to make recordings in private homes." Lord Charles was even more direct in his threats. "Emma, you stupid little girl, do you have any idea what you've done? Give me that device right now, or you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Captain Sullivan stepped forward, placing himself between Emma and the two corrupt men. The recording device was safely in his possession, and he had heard enough evidence to justify immediate action. "Your Honor," Sullivan said firmly, "I believe this recording constitutes evidence of judicial corruption and attempted bribery. As a representative of the Crown, I must ensure that this evidence is preserved and presented to the appropriate authorities." Judge Blackwood's face was red with fury and panic. "Captain Sullivan, you are completely out of line. I order you to return that device immediately and leave my chambers. I'll have you stripped of your rank for this insubordination." But Sullivan had made his decision. Emma's courage in recording the evidence and her desperate signal for help had shown him exactly where his duty lay. "I'm afraid I cannot comply with that order. Your Honor, this child has provided evidence of serious criminal activity, and I am sworn to protect both the innocent and the integrity of the justice system." Emma ran to Sullivan's side. Finally feeling safe for the first time since the custody proceedings began, Lord Charles made another move toward his daughter, but Sullivan's imposing presence in his military uniform stopped him. "Lord Pemberton," Sullivan said coldly, "I suggest you step back immediately. Any attempt to intimidate or harm this child will be met with appropriate force." The confrontation in Judge Blackwood's chambers had reached a critical point. Emma's bravery in recording the conspiracy and her trust in Captain Sullivan had exposed the corruption. But now all three of them faced the wrath of two powerful men whose crimes had been revealed. Judge Blackwood was frantically trying to think of a way to contain the damage. "Captain, surely we can discuss this rationally. That recording was obtained illegally by a minor in a private home. It would never be admissible in any court of law." But Sullivan knew better. "Your Honor, a child's safety takes precedence over technical legal objections. This recording provides evidence that Emma has been placed in danger by a corrupt arrangement between her father and yourself. My duty is clear." Emma looked up at Captain Sullivan with enormous gratitude and relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt that an adult was actually listening to her and protecting her interests. The little girl who had been so frightened and powerless had found the courage to expose the truth, and now she had a champion who would ensure that justice was served. The shocking revelation was about to explode beyond the confines of the judge's private chambers, and everyone involved knew that their lives would never be the same. The tension in Judge Blackwood's chambers had reached a breaking point when Emma suddenly spoke up with surprising clarity and determination. "There's more," she said, her small voice cutting through the heated arguments between the adults. "I recorded other conversations too." Emma pulled a second, smaller device from her shoe where she had cleverly hidden it as backup insurance. "Mummy taught me to always have a spare plan," she explained to Captain Sullivan. "This one has Daddy talking to his lawyer about how they were going to make sure Mummy never got to see me again. Even if she tried to visit, Lord Charles's face went completely. Why does he realize the full extent of his daughter's evidence gathering? Emma, give me those devices right now. You don't understand what you're doing." But Emma stepped closer to Captain Sullivan, finally feeling protected by an adult she could trust. "Daddy, I understand perfectly. You hurt Mummy, and you were going to hurt me too. You told Mr. Hawthorne that you would send me to boarding school in Switzerland where Mummy couldn't find me, and that if I ever tried to contact her, you would make sure she went to prison for something she didn't do." Captain Sullivan was amazed by the little girl's courage and intelligence. Despite being only 7 years old, Emma had recognized the corruption around her and had taken steps to protect both herself and her mother. Her bravery was inspiring, but Sullivan also realized that her actions had put her in even greater danger from her desperate father and the corrupt judge. Blackwood was now frantically trying to salvage his career and avoid criminal prosecution. "Captain Sullivan, I'm ordering you to confiscate those devices as improperly obtained evidence. This child has been manipulated by her mother into making these recordings. They have no legal validity whatsoever." Sullivan looked down at Emma, who was clutching his uniform jacket with one small hand while holding the second recording device with the other. The trust in her eyes reminded him of his own daughter, who was the same age as Emma. His protective instincts completely overrode any concerns about protocol or chain of command. "Your Honor," Sullivan said, with firm determination, "I've heard enough evidence to conclude that this child is in immediate danger. As a Crown representative, I'm placing both you and Lord Pemberton under citizen's arrest pending investigation by the appropriate authorities." The announcement sent shock waves through the chamber. Judge Blackwood laughed bitterly. "Captain, you have absolutely no authority to arrest a sitting judge. This is completely beyond your jurisdiction, and you'll face court-martial for this outrageous behavior." But Sullivan had made his decision based on Emma's desperate signals and the clear evidence of corruption and child endangerment. "My authority comes from my oath to protect the innocent and uphold justice. Your Honor, this child has provided credible evidence that she's been threatened and that this entire custody proceeding is fraudulent." Lord Charles finally lost all pretense of civilized behavior. "You insignificant little soldier. Do you have any idea who I am? I have connections that reach all the way to Parliament. One phone call from me, and your career will be destroyed." Emma flinched at her father's aggressive tone, but she found the courage to speak up again. "Daddy, that's exactly why I made the recordings. You're always hurting people and threatening them. Captain Sullivan is the first grown-up who actually listened to me and believed me." Sullivan knelt down to Emma's level, speaking gently while keeping his eyes on the two men who were clearly becoming more desperate and potentially dangerous. "Emma, you've been incredibly brave, but I need you to do one more thing for me. I want you to go to the main courtroom and ask the court officer to call the police immediately. Can you do that?" Emma nodded eagerly, finally feeling like she had an adult ally who would protect her from her father's threats and the judge's corruption. As she headed toward the door, Lord Charles made a desperate lunge to intercept her, but Sullivan quickly stepped in his path. "Lord Pemberton, I strongly advise you to remain where you are," Sullivan said, his military training evident in his commanding presence. "Any attempt to intimidate or harm that child will result in immediate physical restraint." The confrontation was interrupted by a knock on the chamber door. Lady Margaret's voice could be heard outside, sounding worried and urgent. "Your Honor, I'm concerned about Emma. She's been in there for over an hour. I'd like to check on my daughter's well-being." Judge Blackwood saw an opportunity to regain control of the situation. "Everything is fine, Lady Margaret. Please return to the courtroom, and we'll rejoin you shortly." But Emma had reached the door and quickly opened it, running into her mother's arms. "Mummy, Captain Sullivan is helping us. I have recordings that prove Daddy and the judge are cheating." Lady Margaret's face showed a mixture of relief at seeing her daughter safe and fear at hearing about the recordings. She had suspected corruption, but had been too frightened and powerless to expose it. "Emma, darling, what recordings? What's happening in there?" Emma quickly explained about the conversations she had overheard and recorded, while Captain Sullivan maintained his position between the corrupt men and the mother and daughter. Lady Margaret's lawyer, who had been waiting nervously in the corridor, overheard Emma's explanation and immediately understood the implications. "Lady Margaret," her lawyer said urgently, "if what Emma is saying is true, we need to involve law enforcement immediately. This goes far beyond a simple custody dispute." Judge Blackwood emerged from his chambers, trying to project an air of authority despite his obvious panic. "This is all a misunderstanding. The child has been traumatized by the divorce proceedings and is confused about what she heard. I suggest we postpone this hearing until she can receive proper psychological evaluation." But Emma was not about to be silenced or dismissed. Standing beside her mother and under the protection of Captain Sullivan, she found a strength she had never known she possessed. "I'm not confused. I know exactly what I heard. Judge Blackwood took money from my daddy to give him custody, and Daddy said he was going to send me away so Mummy could never find me." The little girl's clear, determined voice carried down the courthouse corridor. Other people began gathering to see what was causing the commotion. Court officers, lawyers, and clerks all heard Emma's accusations, and the news of the alleged corruption began spreading rapidly through the building. Captain Sullivan realized that the situation was escalating beyond what he could handle alone. "Emma, you did exactly the right thing by making those recordings and asking for help. Now I need everyone to remain calm while we sort this out properly." Lord Charles made one final attempt to intimidate his daughter into silence. "Emma, if you continue with these lies, I'll make sure you and your mother both suffer consequences you can't imagine. Stop this nonsense right now." But Emma had found her voice and her courage. "No, Daddy. I'm not afraid of you anymore. Captain Sullivan believes me, Mummy believes me, and now everyone will know the truth about what you and the judge did." The confrontation had moved from the private chambers into the public corridor, where Emma's accusations could be heard by dozens of witnesses. The scandal was about to explode into the public arena, and nothing would ever be the same for any of the people involved. Within minutes of Emma's public accusations in the courthouse corridor, the situation transformed from a private family dispute into a major criminal investigation. Court officers had called the police, and Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell arrived with a team of investigators who were experienced in handling corruption cases involving public officials. Captain Sullivan had secured the recording devices and was providing a detailed account of everything he had witnessed to Detective Inspector Mitchell. The courthouse had been placed under a temporary lockdown to prevent anyone involved from leaving while initial interviews were conducted. Emma sat beside her mother in a witness room specially designed for child victims. Feeling safer than she had in months, a trained child welfare officer, Mrs. Patricia Hayes, had been called to ensure that Emma's rights were protected throughout the investigation process. "Emma," Mrs. Hayes said gently, "you've been incredibly brave, but I want you to know that you're completely safe now. Can you tell me how you thought to make those recordings?" Emma explained that she had learned about recording devices from watching detective shows on television with her governess. When she overheard the suspicious conversation between her father and Judge Blackwood, she remembered that her mother had a small digital recorder for taking notes. "During her charity work meetings, I knew something was wrong because Daddy was talking about money and making sure the judge would do what Daddy wanted," Emma said with remarkable clarity for a 7-year-old. "Mummy always taught me that judges are supposed to be fair to everyone, not take money to help one person win." Detective Inspector Mitchell was amazed by Emma's intelligence and courage, but she was also deeply concerned about the implications of the case. Judicial corruption involving child custody was one of the most serious crimes imaginable, affecting not only the immediate victims but also public trust in the entire legal system. Meanwhile, in another part of the courthouse, Judge Blackwood and Lord Charles were being questioned separately by experienced investigators. Both men had demanded lawyers. The evidence from Emma's recordings was so clear that their legal representatives were struggling to develop any viable defense strategy. Judge Blackwood's lawyer, Margaret Davidson, was one of London's most respected criminal defense attorneys. But even she was shocked by the clarity of the recorded conversations. "Harold, these recordings are devastating. Your voice is clearly identifiable, and the conversation explicitly discusses money in exchange for custody decisions. We need to consider a plea agreement immediately." Judge Blackwood was still trying to minimize the situation. "Margaret, this is all based on a child's illegal recordings made in a private home. Surely the evidence would be suppressed in any criminal proceeding." But Margaret Davidson knew better. "Harold, when child welfare is involved, courts have much more flexibility in admitting evidence. Combined with the corruption charges, prosecutors will argue that the public interest outweighs any technical evidentiary issues. You're looking at serious prison time if convicted." In the other interview room, Lord Charles was facing even more serious charges. Detective Inspector Mitchell had discovered that his threats against Emma constituted child abuse, and his plans to send her to Switzerland to prevent contact with her mother could be prosecuted as kidnapping conspiracy. Lord Pemberton. Detective Mitchell said firmly, "We have clear evidence of bribery, judicial corruption, child intimidation, and conspiracy to interfere with custody rights. Your daughter's recordings demonstrate that you were willing to harm a child to achieve your goals. This is far more serious than you seem to understand." Lord Charles's lawyer, the expensive Richard Hawthorne, who had been representing him in the custody case, was now facing his own potential legal problems. The recordings revealed that he had been aware of the bribery scheme and had actively participated in planning how to keep Emma away from her mother. Back in the witness room, Emma was working with a police artist to create visual evidence of what she had observed during the dinner meeting between her father and Judge Blackwood. Despite her young age, she was able to provide detailed descriptions of documents she had seen and conversations she had overheard beyond what was captured in her recordings. Emma. Detective Inspector Mitchell said during her interview, "You mentioned that you made a second recording. Can you tell me about the other conversations you overheard?" Emma nodded seriously. "Daddy was talking to Mr. Hawthorne about sending me to a school in Switzerland where Mummy couldn't find me. They said if Mummy tried to visit me or take me back, they would tell the police that she kidnapped me. Daddy said he had friends who would make sure Mummy went to prison." The implications of Emma's testimony were staggering. The conspiracy involved not just bribery and judicial corruption, but also plans for what amounted to international child abduction and false imprisonment charges against Lady Margaret. Detective Inspector Mitchell realized that this case had connections that reached far beyond a simple custody dispute. "Emma, when your father mentioned having friends who could help him, did you hear any names or see any other people at these meetings?" Emma thought carefully before answering. "There was a man with a funny accent who came to dinner one time. Daddy called him Mr. Klaus, and he had papers about schools in Switzerland. He told Daddy that once I was enrolled there, it would be very difficult for anyone to take me away because the school had special protection for wealthy families." This revelation opened up an entirely new dimension to the investigation. Detective Inspector Mitchell immediately contacted Interpol to investigate potential international child trafficking networks that specialized in hiding children from protective parents through exclusive boarding schools. Captain Sullivan, who had been waiting to provide his formal statement, was finally called in to meet with Detective Inspector Mitchell. His decision to intervene had been vindicated by the evidence that emerged, but he knew his career as a Royal Guard would likely be affected by his actions. "Captain Sullivan," Detective Inspector Mitchell said, "your intervention in this case was unprecedented, but it may have saved this child from serious harm. Can you walk me through your decision-making process when you chose to defy Judge Blackwood's authority?" Sullivan explained how Emma's sign language signals had communicated her desperation and fear, and how her courage in trusting him with the recordings had convinced him that immediate action was necessary. "Detective Inspector, I've served the Crown for 15 years, and my oath requires me to protect the innocent above all other considerations. That little girl was crying for help. No protocol or chain of command could justify ignoring her plea." The investigation was moving rapidly as more evidence emerged. Financial investigators had traced the £50,000 mentioned in Emma's recording to an offshore account that Judge Blackwood had established 6 months earlier. Bank records showed that this wasn't the first suspicious payment he had received, suggesting a pattern of corruption that extended beyond the Pemberton case. Lady Margaret was finally able to see her daughter after hours of separation while the initial investigation took place. The reunion was emotional, both mother and daughter crying tears of relief that their nightmare is finally being addressed by competent authorities. "Mummy," Emma said, hugging her mother tightly, "I was so scared. But Captain Sullivan believed me when I told him what Daddy and the judge were planning. He protected me when they got angry about the recordings." Lady Margaret looked up at Captain Sullivan with overwhelming gratitude. "Captain, I don't know how to thank you. Emma told me that you recognized her sign language and understood she was asking for help. Without your intervention, I might never have seen my daughter again." Sullivan was deeply moved by their reunion, but he was also concerned about the ongoing investigation and the potential dangers that still faced both Emma and her mother. Lady Margaret, this investigation is just beginning. There may be other people involved who won't be happy that their activities have been exposed. You and Emma should consider protective custody until we know the full extent of this conspiracy. Detective Inspector Mitchell agreed with Sullivan's assessment. We've discovered evidence that suggests this corruption network may involve other judges and several wealthy families. Emma's bravery in exposing this case may have uncovered a much larger criminal enterprise. As the day progressed, the story began attracting media attention. News of a 7-year-old girl exposing judicial corruption with secret recordings was exactly the kind of story that captured public imagination. Reporters were gathering outside the courthouse, and Emma's courageous actions were being described as those of a young hero who had stood up to powerful, corrupt adults. Judge Blackwood's career was effectively over. The Judicial Conduct Board had been notified of his arrest, and he was immediately suspended from all duties pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. His reputation, built over 20 years of legal practice, was destroyed in a single afternoon by a child's recording device. Lord Charles faced an even bleaker future. In addition to the corruption charges, child welfare investigators were reviewing his history with Emma to determine if there had been ongoing abuse that predated the custody dispute. Emma's accounts of his threats and violent behavior were being corroborated by medical records and testimony from household staff. As evening approached, Emma was finally able to go home with her mother under police protection. She had spent the most important day of her young life fighting for justice and protecting her mother from a corrupt system that would have separated them forever. Captain Sullivan, Emma said as she prepared to leave the courthouse with her mother. Thank you for believing me when I asked for help. Daddy always said that no one would ever believe a little girl over important grown-ups. But you did. Sullivan knelt down to Emma's level one more time, deeply moved by her courage and intelligence. Emma, you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. You proved that the truth is more powerful than money or influence when someone has the courage to speak it. The scandal was about to explode into national headlines. But for Emma and her mother, the most important victory had already been won. They were safe. They were together. Justice was finally being served. 6 months after Emma, Pemberton's courageous exposure of the judicial corruption scandal, the case had transformed from a local courthouse drama into a national symbol of justice prevailing over power and money. The little girl who had risked everything to protect herself and her mother had become an inspiration to people around the world. Judge Harold Blackwood had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for judicial corruption, bribery, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The investigation revealed that he had been taking bribes for over 3 years, affecting dozens of custody cases and civil lawsuits. Many of his previous decisions were being reviewed and overturned, providing justice to families who had been cheated by his corruption. Lord Charles? Pemberton faced even more severe consequences. In addition to the corruption charges, he was convicted of child abuse, intimidation of a witness, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He received a 12-year prison sentence and lost all parental rights to Emma. The investigation had uncovered evidence that he had physically and emotionally abused both Emma and Lady Margaret throughout their marriage. Richard Hawthorne, the expensive lawyer who had participated in the conspiracy, was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His law firm collapsed when other clients discovered that their cases might have been compromised by his unethical practices. The legal community used his case as an example of how professional responsibility must never be sacrificed for client loyalty or financial gain. Captain James Sullivan had become a hero in the eyes of the public, but his career path had changed dramatically due to his intervention in the courtroom. Rather than facing punishment for exceeding his authority, he was promoted and transferred to a special unit that investigated corruption within the justice system. His superiors recognized that his quick thinking and moral courage had prevented a serious miscarriage of justice. The Royal Guard created new protocols for situations where guards witnessed potential criminal activity during their duties. Sullivan's case became a training example of how sworn officers must sometimes choose between following orders and protecting innocent people from harm. Emma, now 8 years old, had adjusted remarkably well to her new life with her mother. Lady Margaret had moved them to a quiet countryside village where Emma could attend a normal school and make friends. With other children her age, the little girl who had once faced the prospect of being isolated in a Swiss boarding school was now playing football with the local children's team and excelling in her studies. The recording devices that Emma had used to expose the corruption were donated to a museum dedicated to children's rights. Her story was being taught in schools as an example of how young people could stand up to injustice, even when facing powerful adults who tried to intimidate them. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had been promoted to head a new task force focused on investigating corruption in family court systems. Emma's case had revealed that judicial bribery in custody cases was more widespread than anyone had realized. The task force had opened investigations in 12 other jurisdictions where suspicious patterns had been identified. The international investigation into the Swiss boarding school network had uncovered a disturbing system where wealthy, abusive parents could essentially hide their children from protective family members or social services. 3 schools had been closed. Several administrators faced criminal charges for participating in what amounted to legalized child trafficking. Mrs. Patricia Hayes, the child welfare officer who had worked with Emma during the investigation, had become a close family friend. She visited Emma and Lady Margaret regularly, helping to ensure that Emma received proper support as she processed the trauma of her father's abuse and the stress of being the key witness in such a high-profile case. Emma had also become pen pals with other children who had found the courage to speak out against adult corruption or abuse after hearing her story. A children's advocacy organization had established the Emma Pemberton Courage Award for young people who demonstrated exceptional bravery in protecting themselves or others from harm. Lady Margaret had used her experience to become an advocate for family court reform. She testified before Parliament about the need for better oversight of judges and lawyers in custody cases. And she worked with other parents who had been victimized by corrupt legal professionals. What Emma did required incredible courage, Lady Margaret told a parliamentary committee. She was just 7 years old, facing 2 powerful men who had conspired to separate us forever. But she found the strength to gather evidence and ask for help. We need to create systems that make it easier for children to report abuse and corruption without fear of retaliation. Emma herself had grown more confident and outspoken about issues that mattered to her. She spoke at school assemblies about the importance of telling trusted adults when something was wrong. Even if the people causing problems seemed too important or powerful to challenge, grown-ups always told me that children should be quiet, let adults make decisions, Emma said during one of her school presentations. But sometimes adults make really bad decisions that hurt children. When that happens, kids need to find their voice and ask for help from the good grown-ups who will listen. The financial investigation into the corruption network had recovered over £2 million in bribes and illegal payments. This money was used to establish a fund for families who had been harmed by corrupt custody decisions, providing them with resources to seek proper legal representation and mental health support. Captain Sullivan maintained regular contact with Emma and her mother, having formed a lasting friendship based on their shared experience of standing up for justice. He often visited them in their countryside home, where Emma delighted in showing him her school projects and telling him about her friends and activities. Emma, Sullivan said during one of his visits, "Do you ever regret making those recordings and exposing what your father and Judge Blackwood were doing?" Emma considered the question seriously before answering. "Sometimes I feel sad that my daddy turned out to be a bad person who hurt people. But I'm not sorry that I stopped him from hurting me and Mummy. And I'm glad that other children won't be hurt by Judge Blackwood anymore." The case had also led to legislative reforms designed to prevent future corruption in family courts. New laws required financial disclosure by judges, independent oversight of custody decisions involving wealthy families, and mandatory reporting of suspicious patterns in judicial decision-making as Emma celebrated her 9th birthday in their peaceful countryside home. Surrounded by friends from her new school and the adults who had helped protect her, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrifying day in the courthouse. "Mummy," Emma said as they looked at old photographs. "Remember when I was scared that Daddy would take me away and you would never find me?" Lady Margaret hugged her daughter tightly. "I remember, darling, but you were brave enough to fight back. And Captain Sullivan was there to help us when we needed him most." Emma smiled with the wisdom of someone who had learned early in life that courage and truth were more powerful than money and influence. "I'm glad I learned sign language from my book, and I'm glad Captain Sullivan's brother taught him those signs too. Sometimes little things make big differences." The little girl who had once felt powerless against corrupt adults had discovered that even the smallest voice could change the world when it spoke the truth with courage. Her story continued to inspire others to stand up for justice, proving that heroes come in all sizes and ages,